Hello, good morning to everybody. Welcome to the fourth day of the Women in Learning and Development Conference 2024. My name is Rebecca Prejean, and today I'm here with my friend Melissa Coakley. She's going to be giving us some good information about women, leadership, and training, past, present, and future. Melissa is an avid educator and lifelong learner, passionate about developing impactful content based on thorough data analysis. She is fluent in English and Spanish and is currently expanding her linguistic capabilities by learning Catalan. Wow. Now living in Barcelona, Spain, Melissa enjoys reading extensively and cherishes her time with her family. So obviously a wealth of knowledge that we have here today. And of course, if anybody has questions, please feel free to enter into the chat. But with no further ado, I'm going to let Melissa take it over.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Here, let me just make sure my presentation is visible. There we go. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the slides all right? There we go. Thank you. Okay, so today, women in leadership development, an overview of the past, present, and future. I did tweak how I'm going to end up doing the session a little bit from the description, so I'll explain about that as I go along. And just a few disclaimers from the beginning. I'll try to describe some of the images as I go along for accessibility. Most of them are just to make things a little interesting. This is an AI-generated army of corporate leadership women, all wearing various pantsuits and pencil skirts, looking ready for action. And another quick disclaimer, women, I weave the topic of what things look like from the lens of a woman's perspective throughout the presentation. When I say women, I'm referring to everyone who identifies as a woman or who is socialized as a woman or who feels seen by the word woman. All right, so this is, oops, I swapped this side out for a more colorful slide. So a little bit more about me. Rebecca did a great job introducing me, so thank you for that. Here I am with my family. This is a picture from 2018, which is the last, first, and only time we attempted one of those matching Christmas pajamas pictures, which my daughter, who's now 5, I think she would like the idea a lot better now. She hated it, but there they all are. They're very cute. And like Rebecca said, I live just outside of Barcelona, Spain. For fun, here's another AI photo. I live in a coastal town that has a lot going on. There's a really big carnival here. There's a there's like a horror film festival as well where people dress up. And I told AI that I like to read and listen to podcasts. So I think that's represented by the person in the corner with the enormous book and the headphones. And for projects, a lot of these are still ideas in my head rather than fixed projects, right? But the underwater house, I think, is AI's version of, we just bought our house last year, and we're starting to do home exchanges where we switch with other people who want to be on vacation here. So our first official one is this summer, where I'm going with my family back to the Boston area where I'm originally from, and a family from there is coming here, and we're excited to do that in a bunch of other different places. And yeah, like I said, I live by the beach, and I am planning, if the timing works out, to take a snorkel underwater photography class this summer. So fingers crossed I can get a spot on that course. Okay, so jumping into the topic of leadership development, before I get into the agenda, I just wanted to take a temperature check and ask what you understand by the term leadership development. It's a term that comes up a lot in the training industry. But what exactly does it mean to you? If you could just put a few keywords in the chat. So for example, when you think of leadership development programs, what kinds of topics would you say those cover? And who's the audience for leadership development programs? And then finally, like, when you envision a leadership development program, how is it happening? What does it look like? So yeah, a lot of management, right? Improving leaders' performance and coaching, managing teams, time management, mentoring. Yeah, formal and informal programs. That's exactly. Yeah, a lot of management, mentoring, onboarding. Okay, great. So I think we're on the same page, right? The traditional definition of leadership development is skills training for either people who are currently managing teams or for people who have the potential to manage teams. And we'll get into some nuances and some opinions I have about whether that should still be the case in 2024. And for the session today, so leadership development in the past, I touch very lightly on this. I started to do some digging around in the past, and there's not maybe the leadership development field as we know it now is much different than it used to be in the past. It didn't used to be as much of a thing. So I'll spend very little time on the past, a lot of time on 2024, what's involved in leadership development topics, who the audience is, who it should be, ways of implementing programs, and ways of assessing skills and assessing the success of a program. And then I touch on the skills and how they relate to women and the future briefly as well. So yeah, I'll go to the next slide and explain something else that I changed sort of halfway along the way. Right, so what did leadership development look like 20 to 50 years ago? It existed. So the focus was on like sort of the traditional definition of what you would think of leading a team, managing people, making decisions, having a vision, strategy. It was mainly for senior leaders or for people who a company might think that these people have the potential to become leaders. Implementation was usually, in person during the 9 to 5 office hours. Offsite retreats were popular as well. I came across a document, an Army document, actually, from the early 2000s, the early aughts, analyzing different leadership program formats. And there was a whole category just for outdoor sports activities, which I thought kind of made me chuckle. Like, I don't feel like that's as much as a thing anymore. Let me know if your company trains leaders through competitive sports below, because I'm interested in it. Now it strikes me as something that's hard to imagine putting senior leaders in physical competition with one another. So yeah. And the measurement, there wasn't as robust. The management was like, did you lead a good team? Did you get good results? There wasn't as much of a focus on management. One thing, so this leads to an executive decision I made about this presentation, women in leadership and leadership development. I had started to prepare a whole bunch of background information on women in leadership, percentages, barriers, discrimination. I scrapped the slide. Why? Because you, my audience, you're people involved in learning and development. You're at a conference focused on women, and you're at a talk focused on leadership development. I feel like you probably know what the general picture of things is in that sense. It's grim. There are a lot of graphs that say what percentage of women are CEOs at Fortune 500. There are like 10 of them. You've probably heard of them. The numbers are not good. They've gotten marginally better. Like, they're not great overall for women. They're much, much worse for women of color. We know this. So I do have a bunch of, if you have any friends, family, coworkers who say, oh, I don't know if that's true, send me a message on LinkedIn. I'll send you all the reports and statistics and white papers I have bookmarked with all those hard numbers in case anyone doubts it. But I think we're all on the same page there. So I'll just leave you with the TLDR version, is that it was grim. So this is the past. On to the future. Well, no, on to the future. Let's do the present first. On to the present. So, oops, my slide's a little stuck. Okay. Leadership development in 2024. So we all know, and we've heard from a lot of speakers at this conference, right, that the current landscape is changing for training for everyone, largely because of technology related to artificial intelligence. So how we work is changing right now. It's going to change more in the future. We don't quite know how. So in the training world, there are a lot of discussions about how to upskill employees so that they're comfortable with AI, how to upskill leadership so that when they're strategizing and thinking about the big picture, they're incorporating AI. But what's happening is something that Ethan Mollick, who's a very prominent researcher in AI and who has an amazing LinkedIn account and posts a lot of AI insights. So he's one to watch if you're not following him and you're interested in this topic. But he, in his newsletter, published an article about something called the weight calculation. And I think it's really related to how we're approaching training and upskilling right now in 2024. And the weight calculation is this. So if you want to build a rocket and go to another galaxy, what's the best way to go about that? You can leave, you can, get your rocket ready, go to the rocket store, get a rocket in 2024, get on the rocket and go, and it'll take 12,000 light years, but you're on your way. Or you can spend the next 50 years, on a beach, you can learn gardening, you can write a novel. And then in 50 years, technology will have advanced to the point where maybe there's a fusion rocket, maybe there's a robot that turns into a rocket, and maybe it only takes you 50 years. And so the move there is to wait for technology to catch up and then make big decisions. And this applies to the world of work more recently, because when Gen I came out, there were tons of startup companies doing things like, a startup company where you can integrate PDFs into ChatGPT and it can analyze it for you. And then a few months later, ChatGPT released that feature. So those companies became obsolete pretty quickly. Now we're in a position, it is March of 2024, a new version of ChatGPT is due to come out in a few months. Claude, other versions of Gen AI are getting better every day. And so we're still riding a big wave of where is this technology going to peak? What is it actually capable of? Where are we going with this? How will it impact industries? I think where a lot of us are getting comfortable with using it to do our day-to-day activities, but maybe like the crux of those day-to-day activities haven't changed so much for so many people. They will, we're still not sure how. So upskilling people on a new workflow that doesn't exist yet, that's going to totally change in 6 months when the new thing comes out, maybe we're at a point where upskilling for AI, absolutely. Basic user function, yes. Upskilling to learn a whole new way of working based on AI, we're not there yet because we don't know what it is yet. So this is a little bit of a funny time for training and for the world of work, in that, yes, we need to upskill in what's valuable in the short term, what's valuable in the long term, what's not going to become obsolete. So I think that's something that we're all thinking about. I think one potential thing to consider with this is leadership development skills, which are, like we said, the audience is generally leaders. But if we drill down into what exactly are those skills, I saw someone mention change management, feedback, managing cultural change. Those are not just for leaders, I would argue. And these skills, a lot of them are interpersonal skills that are as evergreen as skills can get. I mean, we don't always talk about skills in the same way, or interpersonal skills in the same way. Over the years, the language changes, but the heart of communicating with other people and building relationships, that's pretty evergreen. And those are skills that maybe they'll really come into play as things change quickly a little bit down the road, but they can also be applied to everyone's day-to-day work right now. So to give you an idea of some examples that we were talking about, what are the most in-demand skills? So at ELB Learning, we have sort of a suite of off-the-shelf content in the most demanded leadership skills. That one of the things we do is we can take some existing content and customize it for a particular need or situation, but the baseline of the content is there. This is a sample of some of the most requested content we get. And so looking at this, which falls under the umbrella of leadership development, looking at these skills that are usually in the form of a workshop, which are the ones that you think only apply to leaders, to senior leaders at companies? And which are the ones that you think have larger applications for more of the workforce? Oh, so many. And while I'm waiting for answers to this, I'm reading the chat. So many interesting points. Yeah, Ashley says they could all be applied to anyone. Yeah, a lot of them do apply to a lot of people. There's some, you could argue that the emotionally intelligent leader is directed at leaders. A few of them that have leadership in the title, maybe they have a little bit more specific content for leading teams. But so many of these that are so popular, again, popular with leadership development, really apply to everyone. Feedback is a huge one. Everyone should be giving and receiving constructive feedback in a way that has a positive impact, and that's a skill. Yeah, a lot of these are skills that do apply to everyone. Okay, and like debatable, right? So some things, oh, and I talk about this later, Toddy. Yeah, that's true. Coaching and mentoring. Usually the people that benefit from that are more senior leaders, although coaching as a management technique is really popular right now as well, which I think is a positive development too. Okay, so we have these skills that a lot of times fall under the umbrella of what's called leadership development. But I would argue, and a paradigm shift that I would like to see is that skills like this and training and upskilling and practice in skills like this should be focused on a larger audience and should be, instead of leadership development, should be called human-centered development. And when we talk about these interpersonal skills or these human-centered skills, we're not just talking about for leaders, we're talking about for everyone. As we all are thinking about what is my work going to look like, it's going to look different. And so what makes us human, building relationships and communicating with one another and the best possible versions of ourselves, that is going to be very valuable. It's very valuable now. It'll be more valuable. There'll be more of a focus on it. Okay, so building on that a little bit, the audience is expanding. So the typical audience for leadership development is the leadership team. A lot of new managers, the transition from an individual contributor to a manager can be a little bit of a shock to the system, and there's a skill set that can come with that people benefit from some training there. A lot of companies now have programs for potential leaders, people who are maybe interested in management and want to explore what that looks like, which is great. A lot of companies are offering this type of training to high-performing individual contributors. People in the company who maybe they're not managing a team, but they're customer-facing, they're building relationships with clients or with suppliers or with other people. And there's a focus now on making sure that those relationships are solid, that the skills necessary to build these good relationships are present and valued across the entire workforce. There's also some research on, I'm not generally a huge fan on like generational research, like that millennials need this and Gen Z needs that. And I take all of that with many, many grains of salt. However, one piece of research that I saw recently that I didn't check about how accurate it was, but it feels true and I liked it, was that younger generations, Gen Z, as they enter the workforce, it's important to them to have a mission, to have a company with values that they share, and to have opportunities for growth in all forms. And that's lovely. And that's a great opportunity for companies to look at whether they're promoting a learning culture, what they can do to foster that. So that's making me optimistic for the future of human-centered development. Okay, the next question, in terms of implementation, so is there one right way to implement a human-centered skills development program? So yes and no. There's a study that I absolutely adore that's a meta-analysis, which if you're not, I have a little bit of I was in higher ed for a long time and I read many academic studies about linguistics mostly, but there's a type of academic study called a meta-analysis where people who are just doing fantastic work go through all the published studies on a particular topic, hundreds of studies in some cases, And they have criteria, and they pick out studies that have good design, that are robust, that have interesting results. So it's a really labor-intensive method for finding the absolute best research on a topic. And in this case, at Rice University, there was a study done that was published in 2017 that looked at 335 leadership development programs. And their findings were really interesting and really clear. And they also support a lot of the things that we, as learning and development professionals, ask for and request and talk about all the time. And so it gives us a lot of ammunition to convince people to do it the way that we would like to do it. So what do they find? That leadership development programs generally are successful in the sense that there's learning transfer, people apply the skills later, people enjoy them, people feel that they made an impact. So there are some measurable results that say overall they're generally successful, and that there are some programs with very specific features that are even more successful. And those are programs with these 4 things: that have an initial needs analysis, which we love. All of us here, I think we love a needs analysis, right? Let's look at the actual issue and drill down and find out how to solve for what we're dealing with, instead of let's read an article in Forbes that says we should all be doing change management and set up a workshop. We don't like that. We like the needs analysis, right? And it's backed by super solid research. So in the paper, they talked about the example they sort of held up was a needs analysis at a company that lasted for 6 months. I have never had a client who would be comfortable with letting me do a 6-month needs analysis, but my clients are external. If you're an internal L&D person, you push for it, absolutely. But any needs analysis that helps you make the program for the issue, amazing. The other thing they found was that programs with multiple delivery methods had more success. So not just workshops. Maybe it was workshops and discussion groups, or not just e-learning. Maybe it was e-learning and like the occasional workshop and some coaching. So more than one way of doing things. Opportunities for practice and feedback. Again, that's that experiential learning cycle. So making sure people can put things into practice, reflect, draw conclusions is crucial. And then spaced training sessions. So spaced repetition, which is another thing that we love. So they found that spaced training, one and done events don't have as much of an impact. So, a 1-day, all-day workshop on a topic that never gets touched on again has much less of an impact than maybe a shorter workshop. And then maybe the next week, there's some curated content and someone sends an article, and maybe then there's a social learning element where people have a discussion group. Bringing things up more than once makes them stickier. And this can be like the super basic version of this is maybe to say something and then practice it an hour later. Even that has a better impact of leaving an hour between things than only doing something once. So again, I feel like as learning and development people, I feel like we all knew this, but now if you weren't aware of the study, you have this really nice study to say, look at the evidence. Yeah. Okay. So is there one right way to do it? You doing these 4 things is I would argue is a right way to do it, but there are also options, right? So specifically looking at the delivery methods, it's really great to incorporate blended learning solutions, not just because of what the research says on this is stickier learning, but it also really lets you customize programs to your specific situation. So all of these ways of upskilling and teaching these human-centered skills, I think, have the potential to work really well. I think they work beautifully together depending on what your goal is, right? So for live events, things like facilitated workshops, these are really impactful. They also send a message that, this skill, the focus of this is important to the company. It's important to the leaders. It's important to everyone. The logistics and the budget for events like this, depending on the size, can be a challenge as well. So whether it's a weekly live event or whether it's in once a year annual sales kickoff or something like that, where people all get together, it's nice to incorporate things like this when it's possible. And then self-paced learning activities, which can be e-learning, which can be, curated content that someone sends a relevant article once a week for everyone to talk about, even reflection guides, journaling, things like that. These also have, benefits and drawbacks. They scale beautifully. So if there's something that the whole company needs to look at and it's thousands and thousands of people, a quick self-paced activity that fits into everyone's schedule can be nice. AI is also really, in my opinion, upping the quality of a lot of self-paced e-learning type events. I talk a little bit more about this later, but there's so much more opportunity to personalize these things than there was in the past. So self-paced doesn't need to be like a click-through e-learning that everyone, goes through as fast as they can. Another thing about self-paced activities is that they can be a little bit less engaging. If it is sort of a click-through course or general content, it can be hard for people to fit into their schedules, especially if they're busy, they have other priorities, and there can be a little bit of a lack of accountability. So it depends. And then I love social learning communities, especially as an add-on to any of these things. I think there's so many benefits to social learning communities that go beyond learning objectives. I could do a whole conference on that, so I'll be brief. Accountability groups, cohorts, that kind of thing. It's not only great for learning, it's great for building relationships. Super easy on the budget, really. Like a social learning situation or event, it can be a Slack channel that someone's in charge of keeping an eye on and encouraging interaction on. It can also be like a beautiful LXP with lovely interactive elements that tracks participation. If you want something more robust, there are more robust opportunities for this as well. But it's so flexible. It does a lot of wonderful things too. Things like cohorts in learning. They're great for learning, but they're also great for other issues. Like if your teams are working in silos, and that's one of the things that the company wants to improve, putting together thoughtful cross-functional cohorts. It's not just about the learning objectives. It can be a lot about building those relationships. And then continuous learning opportunities. So this is sort of a catch-all bucket. A lot of the continuous learning opportunities have elements of all the other things I've talked about. But this can be executive coaching, which I think Tati mentioned is usually mainly available to the senior team. It is like one of the more expensive, sort of exclusive options. But it can also be, having a regular cadence with the team where there's discussion guides and we get together, elements of social learning again, or professional development plans that hold someone accountable. So these can be hyper-personalized. They can be kind of on an individual level. On the drawbacks would be that sometimes they're pricey, and that a lot of times it depends very much on your company. It depends on your manager and the resources that are available to you in your particular situation. Okay. So what do these programs look like? I feel like I've talked about this a lot, so I'll go a little bit faster. But just to visualize how these things can fit together, there's no one solution. But for example, if there's something that senior leadership is doing a program on to upskill and it's on site, maybe they would do something a little bit like the left-hand column, where it's live learning events that have an impact that they can fit into their schedule, because senior managers sometimes making time for those self-paced learning events, it's sometimes a challenge for them. So here at the live learning events, there's a little bit more visibility and accountability, and that can have more of an impact. And then the self-paced learning activities, maybe there's something hyper-personalized for that senior leader that applies directly to their work they're doing. That's like, make an action plan for how your team is going to upskill. So, self-paced, but hyper-personalized. Social learning, I've found, is a little bit trickier with senior leadership, because it is a more informal way of learning. And so I think one of the things on the past slide, you have to be conscious of the power dynamics and the hierarchies. For some people, it's not an issue, but they're, you have to be mindful of who you're putting in conversations together. And if people are with direct reports, especially if it's something about, change management, where there's some uncertainty, it can be a little bit sensitive. So maybe I would rely a little bit less on that. And then again, the senior execs a lot of times have access to some coaching, some mentoring, one-on-one things like that. I'm not going to go through all 4 of these, but just like to compare really quickly to a hybrid onboarding learning plan, where maybe there's not the budget for a lot of live learning events, 1 or 2 a year to bring the team together and to build momentum, right? But self-paced learning activities are nice for onboarding because they scale well. And because people who are onboarding tend to be really excited about a new challenge. They have a lot of processes and background information to get up to speed on. And that's usually, I feel like at the beginning of a job is usually when people are super engaged, hopefully. So it's a good time to take advantage and do that self-paced. Social learning is also great for these situations. If there are cohorts onboarding, they're in a new situation, they can give each other peer support in an environment that there'll be less judgment or less concern about how they look. So that can be a nice way to build stronger relationships. And then with a lot of social learning, you can also think about, okay, if they can have support from their peer groups, that's great. That helps them build relationships. And that maybe takes a little bit of the pressure off of their direct manager. Maybe instead of checking in with them 2 or 3 times a week, they can have a one-on-one once a week and see how it goes. All of this depending on the particular situation, right? So you get the idea. This can be scaled up, scaled down, tweaked. One size doesn't fit all. It's very flexible. All right, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about assessment, but I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent. So I'm going to tell you about, well, under the guise of talking about how we assess these skills, I'm going to tell you about a podcast episode, a podcast called Hidden Brain, which I adore, but a podcast episode that I was looking it up for this presentation and I realized it's from July 2016. So that means I've been thinking about this question for 8 years, since July 2016. Like I think about this all the time. Here's what it is. So they had an interview with Laszlo Bock, who was the head of people operations at Google in 2016. And they were looking at Google was doing, probably is still doing really innovative things with how they build their workforce. And Laszlo Bock was saying, we have a hard time finding people. Like the traditional way to do it is to go to the best schools, people with the best grades, but those aren't always the people who succeed at Google. So they reverse engineered what they wanted in a candidate. And they looked at all the people who were doing really well at Google, like the ideal people who were contributing, fitting in, fabulous. And they said, okay, what's the profile of these people that are doing great? And they extrapolated some things from that. And they said, okay, now we have our data set for what we're looking for. One of the ways they did that is this. In an interview for a software engineer position, they would ask, okay, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate yourself as a software engineer? And they found that the answer to this question was a strong predictor of a successful career at Google. So before I say more, really quick, imagine, I don't know if anyone here is a software engineer. I am not, so I have to imagine, right? But imagine you're a software engineer at this interview with Google, and they say, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate yourself as a software engineer? What would you say? Remember, in this world, you are a software engineer, so you don't have to say 0 if you don't know anything about software engineering. Okay, 4, 3, 3, 3. Did they all say 4 or 5? Okay. Ooh, Tanya, spoiler. Okay, what if I told you that their best answer was different for men than for women? So I mean that Laszlo Bock said, if a man says this number, we think he will probably be a good fit. If a woman says this different number, we think she'd probably be a good fit. So they're looking for a different best answer from men and women. Michelle's not surprised. I was shocked in 2016 with this. So if you want, just on a piece of paper or whatever, just on a Post-it or in the chat if you want, what do you think they wanted to hear from women, and what do you think they wanted to hear from men? Okay. And I'm not going to draw it out. Here's the big reveal. From men, the best answer, they said, is a 4. Google wanted to hire men who said, I'm a 4 out of 5. And why? So the interviewer said, he said, our hypothesis is that because men tend to overestimate their capabilities on average, men tend not to be as self-aware as women. And for a man to say a 4 was a signal, not the only one, but a signal that maybe this guy's a little more self-aware. Maybe he realizes he has something to learn. And that was positively correlated with success here at Google. And if you're a woman, yes, Sarah, a lot of you saw this coming. See, this has been living with me for 8 years. If you're a woman, they said, if we want to hear 5. And he said, our hypothesis there is because there's so much societal pressure on women to be self-effacing and humble and hang back and be modest and wait until they're certain rather than raising their hand at the first opportunity like men on average do. That if a woman says she's a 5, first of all, she's probably going to have higher EQ and social perceptiveness on average. And second, she's going to be amazing. So yeah, 8 years I've been thinking about this. I have a lot of thoughts about all of this and what it means. But I would love to hear from you. So first, what do you think about Google using this as a recruitment tool? Like, do you think it's great? Do you think it's questionable tactics? Do you think it's a terrible idea? Yeah. Okay. A lot of, I think it's questionable as well. Okay. Interesting. See, I didn't have as negative a reaction as some of you in the chat are having. I think it's questionable. I think, the thing I liked about it is it's making space for something that the research shows that hurts women, which is that not, applying for the job unless you tick all the boxes, being expected to be humble. So it's factoring that into the equation. It's not pretending that doesn't exist. I also think, it's also factoring in the thing of that men have a tendency to be overconfident and rate themselves higher. And so that's, in a way, that's not rewarded. But it's very tricky. And also it's one of those things that I just wish wasn't necessary, so it's addressing the reality of a situation that, again, this was 2016. I don't know how different, like the reasons behind these questions, I don't know how different those are. I don't know if he had legal problems for like coming out on a podcast and explaining that he treated men and women differently in interviews. That might have been not something to share publicly, but yeah, it's nuanced, right? And I also this ties into what I'm going to get into next a little bit, which is the whole question of how do you assess these human-centered skills? Like Google used this question not really as a way to test or assess someone's actual abilities, but to assess someone's self-awareness and someone's capacity for being humble and being coachable. So it's an interesting way to do it. I still, 8 years later, can't decide if I support it or do not support it. Okay, so along the same lines, moving on to the skill assessment for these leadership development skills or interpersonal skills, soft skills, however you want to call them. There's a lot of different words for them. But how do you measure these skills? Self-assessment questionnaires, I'm not a fan of them. I put them under good because I also feel like these skills don't get measured very often. So even something like a self-assessment, it's data, right? It's a measurement tool. It's people rating themselves. So that's a place to start. What's the issue with that? It's similar to what Google ran into, which is something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's a cognitive bias that essentially sums up what Google was trying to solve for, which is that confidence and competence are often correlated negatively, meaning that a lot of times people who say that they're very confident about their skills in something overestimate themselves, right? And so people who are very confident in a skill sometimes underestimate themselves because they think, I can do it. I do it all the time, so it's easy. So I'm sure some people do it better than I do. The short explanation of this is that people as a whole, humans are not great at assessing themselves. And I'm sure everyone has examples of people who, felt that their abilities or whatever else was at one place, and you look at them and think, oof, I'm seeing something different than what they see. So yeah, this is pretty common. So self-assessment is a great place to start because a lot of times there's not even that, but it's problematic for all those reasons. And so what else is there, right? Another great technique is getting assessment from other people, 360-degree feedback from people you manage, from people who manage you, from your colleagues. Really does give a nicer picture of maybe where someone's skill level is or the impression that they're making at the very least. Performance reviews as well. Those are better, but those can be a little bit complicated and sensitive to implement. And then there's also, as always, there's the question of personal biases and the personal relationships that you have with people. Another thing, back to the question of women in learning and development, leadership development, is that there have been studies showing that women are judged differently, more harshly. Assertiveness is not seen as positively in some of these situations too. So we're still it's still humans assessing humans. Even if you're not doing it yourself, when people do it for other people, there's still a level of bias there. Of course there is. So what else is there? There is more and more data from real and simulated interactions, which I think is interesting and also has, like everything, right, has its positives and negatives. So what can that look like? Or what does that look like today, for example? So simulations and practice, these can be really great sources of feedback. And here I'm going to give a little bit of a plug for an ELB product, which is one of my favorite ELB products, which is a video coaching tool where learners can get a video prompt or a text prompt, and they actually practice speaking and responding to the prompt. It can be a sales pitch or a presentation or giving feedback. And then they'll get some AI generated feedback on how they did based on some keywords and based on other analytics. And then they also have the option of sending it to their manager for feedback as well. I think this and tools like this are really interesting because the criteria is, I won't say it's completely objective, but it's more objective, right? A rubric that AI will assess an interaction based on. This is probably debatable because AI has inherent bias as well, but AI doesn't have a personal relationship with you that's going to color these things, right? So it's moving towards a place where you get more objective data. And so these kinds of things are getting better all the time. I think there's so much potential in these simulations and practice with less biased criteria. Yeah. And Michelle says the irony of AI giving us feedback on how to sound more human is wild. I know, but humans are not great at it, Michelle. I know that's crazy, but it's wild. Another thing, which I also think is wild, is real data and real interactions. So 2 examples of that. One is Gong is one example of this kind of company. It's a sales enablement company, and they have software that records sales calls and sales communications. And from what's successful and what's not, they extrapolate data on what works, what expressions let people engage with the sales call. Like the top performers, what are they doing differently and how is that quantified? And that kind of thing. Really interesting. Another example that's not a training tool at all, but it's something that has come up with my team recently. So during the month of March, I've been doing these sort of mini podcast episodes where I have conversation with women in the leadership team at ELB Learning. They're lovely conversations to just check in with people, see how people are feeling about being a woman in leadership. And they're posted on the ELB LinkedIn page if you're interested in them. But one of the things that came up a lot was the idea of space in a conversation as a woman. Meaning that a lot of the women felt like either it was difficult sometimes to take up space in the form of voicing an opinion or talking through something or giving an example or having sort of the floor. And it was also a challenge to not feel like you were taking up too much space and to feel like when you do take up space that what you say is valued. So it was sort of, in the conversations, it was a very hard to quantify thing and a feeling and a perception. However, it's interesting to see all these new tools, these new AI tools that if you're having a meeting, super typical corporate practice, the meeting's recorded, we can all refer to it later. And now there are these tools like, for example, Fireflies, like Zoom has one, Teams have one. They give you a meeting summary, action items, and they give you a list of the speakers, and it's a little bit small on my screen. I hope you can see it. And a percentage of how much each person spoke. I think that's fascinating because all these perceptions, or this is like my opinion, or things that I've been hearing, it's a little bit quantified now. Like you can look at a meeting and say, how much did I talk? I felt like another person who maybe is not the decision maker, maybe I'm the decision maker, but I felt like another person who's not the decision maker was dominating the conversation. Is it a feeling or is it a quantifiable thing that happened? I know that I've started doing after meetings. There was one meeting where I felt like, okay, I was talking a lot. I was excited about an idea and I felt like I was going on and on. And I had a moment of thinking, oof, I feel like I overpowered it. I feel like I was speaking too much. I feel like it was a lot. I should dial it back. And then looking at the percentages, it was really evenly divided. I spoke sort of the same as the other 3 or 4 people in the meeting. In my mind, it was much more than that, but in the reality, it was less. And I think, for some leaders, like oftentimes some men, it would be a great exercise for them to do the same thing and think, okay, if Susan is the decision maker and it's her team, how much did I talk? How much did Susan talk? How much did other people talk? Again, it's something that used to be like, oh, this is the impression that I got. Here's the data. It's right here. You can look and you can think about it and reflect on it and improve on it. So interesting. Does this have potentially creepy downsides? Maybe. Here, I do think, okay, this is my opinion. Yeah, I do think that as we have more objective data for assessment of things like how many questions do people ask, how much time do people spend listening versus speaking, I think it will have a positive effect on women because, again, it's quantifying something that was previously hard to quantify. A different question is, how will all this data be used? What kind of data will be used? The same sort of questions about AI in general, right? Which data, how will it be used? How will it affect who? What will be the assessment tool? Like there's a lot to say about the data itself and privacy and whatever else. But from a purely research and impact perspective, the idea of using real data to think about how we can improve these human skills, I think it could be incredibly powerful. And that's something that I'm really interested in. Right. And then, yeah, Natalie says there are people who say very little, but when they do, it's impactful. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. All right, so wrapping up here. So leadership development, the future. So I feel like I don't want to repeat myself too much, but I think and I hope that leadership development is and will be transforming more into something that looks like human-centered skills, interpersonal skills. How can we be the best versions of humans who relate to each other while AI does a lot of things that humans used to do, right? And the focus on the skills we talked about, human-centered skills. I think critical thinking will become very important as information doesn't necessarily pass through or get produced by one person. Being able to size things up and say how valid it is, where it comes from, to ask questions about things. Absolutely. Ethics, I think, will become very important. We're coming up on a time where there are a lot of questions about if AI can do these jobs, what happens to people who are doing these jobs? What happens to people who are doing jobs that support those? Like, there are a lot of ripple effects and a lot of thoughts about how this is all going to be handled. And a lot of time and care should be spent thinking about those ethical questions and thinking about how to frame those ethical questions too. That's also a skill. And then as we come into this sort of turbulent time for the workforce, self-care, I think, is going to be very important. You know, a lot of people, their work is a big part of their identity. And if that shifts fundamentally, that's going to have a lot of psychological implications that everyone needs to be aware of, you know, for themselves and for others around them as well. So change management, but on a more personal level, to how will that affect people emotionally and psychologically, should be something that we're all thinking about and learning about and considering. For the implementation, I think I already talked about that. Live learning activities, I think, will become more valuable as well. Face-to-face communication, social learning, well, the things I already said, social learning. And then the measurements, like, we'll see. I can kind of envision a future where, just like we record meetings, the Slacks and the emails and the phone conversations and social media posts, like, it's pretty easy to scrape all that data and draw conclusions. Who's drawing the conclusions? What are the conclusions being used for? That's something, it's another conference, I think, but all big questions to consider. Yeah. So to leave with a little bit of hope, where I told AI to generate me a hopeful picture about the future of women in learning and development, I do think it will get better. So there's a little bit of buzz now about, super simplified version of Google's philosophy is that, women are better at soft skills and they're getting more important. And so women will be in a better place in terms of leadership. I've read a few articles about that. I don't know. I think it makes a lot of assumption, that line of thinking. It might be true. It's the nice thing is that these skills, I feel like, are more front and center than they ever have been before. And so it's a priority in any rate. And we're having a lot of conversations around them and what that means for leaders and employees and women and everyone. So I think it's moving in a positive direction in that sense. And I'm going to leave it here. That's enough from me, I think. So thank you so much for listening to me talk about these things. I think they're such interesting questions. And as I was designing this, I was saying, I wish this was a facilitated session, because many, many points. I would love to put everyone in breakout rooms and heard everyone's thoughts and had more like actual conversations around this. So yeah, thank you very much. The chat is going quickly. I'm trying to keep up with it and talk at the same time. It's impossible.
Yes.
So
Melissa had so many good comments and lively conversation during your presentation. Obviously sparked a lot of thoughts, a lot of ideas, a lot of visions of what the future is going to look like. And even though we can't all be certain, your presentation gives us a lot of hope that maybe some good things will prevail from AI as opposed to some of the more scary things we hear about. We did get a couple of questions.
Great.
Over here. So let's take a look. So Rita asked, how do you sell ongoing spaced training to leadership?
How do you sell ongoing spaced training to leadership? That's tricky. For leadership, especially. So I think what like a big budget item would be to say, okay, we're doing a 6-month program and there's a workshop every month. That's one way of doing it, right? It's an expensive way of doing it. That can be a hard sell. Another thing that's an easier sell that's I think more manageable is to say, like, this is what you're doing. And then we can also set you up with, here's like a nudge campaign. Here's, an email drip thing where they'll get, a link to a LinkedIn learning class or a link to a Harvard Business Review article about the same thing, and tie things in that way. So it doesn't, like, the traditional way of doing it would be to say 6 months of workshops, and then in 6 months, sign up for 6 more months of workshops. Fantastic, right? But like even something like an email course or like a nudge to answer a poll question on the Slack channel about the topic or something like that is another way of doing training that is less formal but still impactful, is what I would say.
Excellent answer. And it looks like we had one more here from Natalie. Can these simulations scale scoring? For example, if the person didn't get the answer right the first time, but maybe they got it right the second time.
Oh yeah, I think that's a question about rehearsal, about the ELB product. They're different. If you look on the website, there's an explanation, but the short answer is there are different settings. Like, you can do kind of a one and done situation if you want to simulate a high pressure situation. There's also sort of, I think of it, this is going to age me, I think of it as like a voicemail feature where people can practice a few times before they say, okay, this is it. Like, anyone who's old like me, you remember you could leave a voicemail and people would say, oh, do you want to leave this voicemail or do you want to re-record? And you could do it a few times. So that's another nice thing about rehearsal too, is that people usually in those cases do it a few times before they say, okay, that was the definitive one, I'm going to keep that one, which is like a sneaky way of encouraging people to practice more as well. So yeah, it depends on the settings is the short answer, Natalie.
Right. So it's one of those things where it's a really good option to maybe look at, especially when we're talking about simulations and needing something a little different for folks to learn, because I'm sure, as you know, folks learn different ways. So yeah. As usual, lots of great information from Melissa. I'm going to give a couple more minutes to see if anybody has any questions for our sage on the stage, as I like to say.
Do you know if I can see the chat after we finish? Because I didn't have time to read everything. I want to go back and read what everyone said. Is that
I believe it is. I'm going to check with Lewis and Cindy, but I believe that is something we can help you with and get you a copy of the transcript. And I don't blame you, because this session, they were full conversations. Within the chat.
I said, I was listening to the breakout rooms. I was talking to Rebecca before the presentation. I said, I'm like a teacher by trade from back in the day, and I still have the urge to sort of walk around and check on everyone and say, what are you doing? What do you think? How did it go? And it's frustrating sometimes to be a presenter instead of a facilitator and not get into it with everyone.
I can assure you this session, lots to talk about, lots of opinions, lots of thoughts, but that just shows you how your session resonates with where we are right now in learning and development, and the things that we're seeing and the trends that we're seeing, and just some of those past, present, and future things that we talked about so well. Lewis said that he can get it to you after the event wraps. So you're going to be able to see all of your session in all of its glory. But if nobody has any more questions, I want to say thank you again to Melissa for gracing us with her presence and giving us all of her information and her wisdom. If anybody has any questions, reach out to her via her LinkedIn, www.linkedin.com/Melissa Coakley. And we'll see you guys again in about an hour or so for another session.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Rebecca.
You're so welcome. Right. Bye, guys.
Bye.